right, I wanted to make a recording to help familiarize you with the 12 cranial nerves. And I want to make it, there are only 12 of them. This doesn't have to be painful. And we're going to break it down even further. We're going to break it down into 4 different groups of cranial nerves based on their morphological locations. So first, we'll look at the ones that are anterior to the pituitary. They're going to be the olfactory and optic nerves. Then we'll look at the ones that are superior or lateral around the pons. So you know this is part of the brainstem, that middle area of the brainstem. And these 3 are going to be the oculomotor, trochlear, and trigeminal nerves. And then we'll look at those that are inferior to the pons, another group of 3. It's going to be right at the interface between the pons and the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior part of the brainstem. And then we're going to look at the last, our final 4 are going to be associated with the medulla oblongata. And by associated with, I mean that's the part of the brainstem that these emerge from. And they're going to be the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, and we used to call it the spinal accessory nerve in our lab manual. Now we call it the accessory spinal nerve in our lab manual, which is why I'm remaking this video. And then our final 12th cranial nerve is hypoglossal nerve. So you might notice that there are names for each of these and there's a Roman numeral. And yes, we need to know both of those. But that is going to be super easy because we have a mnemonic. This is the old mnemonic that we used to use when we called cranial nerve number 11 the spinal accessory nerve. But now that we're calling it the accessory nerve, we're not going to learn it that way. Instead, here is our mnemonic. Our mnemonic, which is kind of silly. Old Olympians try to aggravate, only old Olympians try to aggravate fat vegans gulping veggies and hummus, because who else would have the strength to aggravate a fat vegan? So only old Olympians try to aggravate fat vegans gulping veggies and hummus. If you look at the first letter of each of these words here, OOOTTAFVGVAH, and if you were to write those down on a piece of paper, then you would have a hint for each of these: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. So that's the mnemonic that we're going to use, and here's a simple drawing that I made to first kind of introduce these 12 cranial nerves. First 2, super easy, in front of the pituitary gland. So here's our pituitary gland. These are the mammillary bodies here. And just to, you probably already know them. Cranial nerve number 1, you only have one nose, so cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. And these are the olfactory tracts in the central nervous system. We refer to what in the peripheral nervous system you would call a nerve, so a long bundle of myelinated axons. In the central nervous system, we call it a tract. So this is the tract of the optic nerve, and then at the end, actually, there'd be a little bit of enlargement here, and those are the olfactory bulbs, and they sit right above the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, which you already know, and hopefully when you learn the cribriform plate, you saw little holes in that, and that is the top of the nasal surface, the nasal cavity surface, and there are little sensory extensions that come out of these olfactory bulbs and go through the holes in the cribriform plate that allow you to smell. So that's why it's so important. Cranial nerve number 2, you have 2 eyes. So cranial nerve number 2 here is the optic nerve. And what you see in your left eye, you are actually, the sensory information is going into the right side of your brain. And so our optic tracts, they're going to, or optic nerves actually, because out here, once they leave the brain case, we call them optic nerves. These are going to cross at that optic chiasm, which we see just anterior to the pituitary. All right, so our next set of 3 cranial nerves. So we're kind of moving back, we're moving dorsal, and we're moving down, we're moving inferior. And so now we come to the pons. So this big sort of bulbous, smooth area of the brainstem is the pons. And we're going to go from medial to lateral. So as we look medial here, we have cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. Then as we move lateral, we have cranial nerve number 4, which is the trochlear nerve. and then cranial nerve number 5, which is a big old stalk of a nerve called the trigeminal nerve. And it is a little bit more medial than the trochlear nerve. So we move kind of in toward the middle again, and it comes off kind of the lateral surface of the pons toward the middle of it. And it immediately branches off. So trigeminal makes a trident. And these 3 branches that come off this big stocky thing are going to be the ophthalmic branch, then which is going to go to the eyes. The maxillary branch, you know, the maxilla, where Max would have a mustache on the face. That is our second branch that extends out here. And then our third branch is the mandibular branch. So you know the mandible, that's the lower jawbone. And those are the branches that we have coming off the trigeminal nerve. And that's it for the pons. So great. Our second group is down, and the third group is going to be between the pons and the medulla oblongata. So you can see we have these 3 nerves kind of in this peachy color coming off here. Again, going from medial to lateral. Most medial is cranial nerve number 6, the abducens nerve. Cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve, and then most lateral, cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibule and the cochlea are structures of the inner ear, and if you remember back when you looked at the temporal bone, we had that petrous portion of the temporal bone, that peaked mountainous portion of the temporal bone, and that's where the structures of your inner ear sit on the skull. And the vestibulocochlear nerve, that's where it's headed to innervate the structures of the inner ear so that you can hear. Then we only have one group left, and it is these 4 nerves that are all kind of extending off of the medulla oblongata down here, the final part, the most inferior part of the brainstem. The most superior of these nerves, and you'll notice these look different. They're not sort of the cable or thread-like structures that we saw up above, but instead these kind of fan out, and they run together more. I'll show you here in a second than the way that I have them drawn here. But first, I wanted us to be able to orient ourselves to them, and then we'll look at them on the model. So cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal. This is the most superior one that comes off the medulla oblongata. The next one is cranial nerve number 10, right? If you score a perfect 10, then you might as well go to Vegas, but to score a perfect 10, you need an A, not an E here. So cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. And as we continue down the lateral part of the medulla oblongata, we get to cranial nerve number 11, which is the accessory or spinal accessory nerve, but we're learning it as the accessory nerve. And this one is a little bit harder to spot, not the way it's drawn here, but the way you'll see on the model, because it actually has many fibers that kind of come up from the area that is just superior to the spine. And so this one is not going to be as obvious on our models, but I'll show you how to find that. So that's cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. And then we move toward the middle of the medulla oblongata. And this is our final number 12, cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. And you've seen the hypoglossal canal already, right? Which is just adjacent to the foramen magnum on the occipital bone, and that is how this guy is going to escape from the cranium, is through those hypoglossal canals. So cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. So let's take a look at all of these on the brain model. Here's your pituitary, the mammillary bodies. These would be the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain, the pons right here, the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. That's your brainstem. Down here we have the spinal cord. So these are actually spinal nerves. They are not cranial nerves. And so with the cranial nerves, we stop kind of right here. And then you can see the cerebellum here. And this is our cerebellum or cerebral cortex up here. All right, so let's take our groups. This is the pituitary gland. So let's go anterior to the pituitary. We had cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerves. And this is the olfactory bulb, kind of this area here. And this is the olfactory tract. Then the second one that we had is the optic nerve, and this back here would be the optic chiasm. where you can see that they would connect. But this one would extend to the left eyeball, and this one over here would be extending to the right eyeball, which would sit there. So these are the optic nerves, cranial nerve number 2. So now we need to go here around the pons. I don't think the oculomotor nerve is very, maybe it's this white dot right here. But it should be along this very medial area of the pons here. And so that must be it, that white dot right there. The trochlear nerve kind of hugs this, the very top of the pons here. And so that is our cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve right here. And then this big, fat, stocky branch, that's the trigeminal nerve. And that is going to branch off pretty quickly into those 3 branches, the optic, the maxillary and mandibular branches over here. And that's it for superior to the pons or off the lateral surface of the pons. So now we go down to just superior to the medulla oblongata at the bottom of the pons. And that's this group of 3, 1, 2, and 3. And they are cranial nerves number 6, the abducens. So we move outside of that. Cranial nerve number 7, facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. And that's it for the ones that are between this interface of the pons and the medulla oblongata. So now we get to move down to the medulla oblongata and the final 4. This is it. Here in the final 4, let's start along the lateral surface of the medulla oblongata with cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal nerve. And you see how these aren't so cable-y looking anymore. It's more like we see kind of branches fanning together. And I drew lines on this side so that you could, because it almost looks like it's just one big mass, but it's not. So you kind of have to help yourself see that there is one bulbulous structure kind of up here, and that is going to be our cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. And so here it is on the left-hand side. And then over here we have, as we move down from that, so as we go below this blue line here, that is going to be cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. So vagus kind of gets sandwiched here in between the glossopharyngeal and the accessory nerve. So I have it written here as spinal accessory, but we want to know it as the accessory nerve. And you can see how these fibers actually kind of come up from down below, and they meet with some that are up here, and all of that kind of branches off together. And that is the accessory nerve down here. Our final, I feel like we should have a drum roll. Drum roll for number 12, the hypoglossal nerve, which is what, it's this whole big Mac Daddy that comes off kind of between the olive and the pyramid of the medulla oblongata. So that is our hypoglossal nerve, nerve number 12. And these guys are not cranial nerves, spinal nerves, because this is our spinal cord. That is where we kind of differentiate between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord down below. All right,